Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be doing a video that has been requested for a while and that I'm really excited to get into here. I'm going to be ranking the studio albums of the Rolling Stones from worst to best. There's 26 albums here in total that I'm going to be ranking, lots of different eras of the band to get into, so that said, let's dive right in. Coming in at number 26, I'm going to go with Dirty Work, released in 1986. Just a bland, uninspired record, pretty much considered by most of the fan base to be their worst album here. The band were barely communicating at this point, and the songwriting was lacking as Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were really not getting along, really not talking to each other all that much, and so it was rare to see the entire lineup in the studio together at this point, but, it does feature some good stuff, right? I do enjoy the cover of Harlem Shuffle, and I dig One Hit to the Body, but other than that, nothing really on this album that stands out to me, and I do consider it, like a lot of other people do, to be the band's rock bottom. So with that in mind, getting us started here, number 26, my least favorite Stones record is going to be Dirty Work from 1986. Following that up now with number 25, let's go with Undercover from 1983. In addition to having one of the worst album covers of all time, in my opinion, this record features more bad blood than the band here. That really compromised this record due to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards both wanting to take the group in different directions musically, right? So this album is pretty all over the place, in my opinion, almost like the band were just throwing every idea they possibly could, come up with at the wall to see what stuck, and really did forego any kind of consistency, in my opinion. So I think this record sounds dated, and I wouldn't call anything on here to be classic Rolling Stones. We're going to go now to 2016 for my number 24 for Blue and Lonesome. Some really fun bluesy covers on here. It's an entirely covers record, but not an outstanding Rolling Stones album. I think it's fun for what it is, right? It's a decent covers album, but not one that I gravitate towards all that much when it comes to, when I want to listen to classic Stones or anything like that. But, solid, fun nonetheless. Really a harmless covers record here by the Stones, released in 2016, Blue and Lonesome. It is kind of cool to hear the band jamming and, doing some covers to some songs that influenced them. 23, Bridges to Babylon, released in 1997. It's another record that's a little bit all over the place, in my opinion. It features, a laundry list of guest musicians, as well as many different samplings of other genres on here, like hip-hop and rap. So, pretty eclectic album. And on top of that, there are 3 Keith Richards tracks, which is pretty unprecedented on this album. And I don't find the material to be all that great on here. It is a solid effort, in my opinion. A bit over the top of a record, in my opinion, as well. But, not an album I listen to all that often. So, while it's not awful, I don't consider it to be top shelf Stones by any means. And, again, not an album I gravitate towards all that much. So, coming in at number 23 here, let's go with Bridges to Babylon from 1997. For number 22, let's go with Voodoo Lounge from 1994. This is the first Stones album released without Bill Wyman in the band. It's a decent album with some fun tracks on here. It sounds like old school Stones, and the material, though, does not really reflect that. It's not necessarily on that level, but the sound they were going for is a bit of an old school approach, so I do definitely appreciate that. I do enjoy certain tracks on here. I think there are some really underrated gems on this record that don't get talked about nearly as much, like the Keith Richards track Through and Through, as well as You Got Me Rocking, and the opener Love Is Strong, which features some really underrated vocals by Mick Jagger. How about the Rolling Stones Now, released in 1965? It's the third U.S. studio album by the Stones. It's mostly a collection of previously released tracks in the UK. More solid 60s, early Stones rock here. I dig early Stones. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, a little bit later on this list here as we, get into, the top 20, I guess you would say. But, when it comes down to it, this is probably my least favorite of the early Stones era, but still not bad by any means. Number 20, A Bigger Bang from 2005. Until Hackney Diamonds, this was the last Stones album of original material to be released. It's a fun record for sure, definitely a back-to-the-basics approach here, but still comes up a bit short when trying to emulate that classic Stones output of the 60s and 70s, but nonetheless, there are some really fun tracks on here that I enjoy. Look at the track listing here, I really enjoy Rough Justice, Let Me Down Slow, Won't Take Long is fine as well. Let's see, Oh No, Not You Again is a really fun live track from this tour as well, so there are some decent songs on here that I think are solid, but again, not necessarily classic Rolling Stones, although it does have its moments. We're going to go back to the early Rolling Stones stuff here for my number 19. We have 12 by 5, released in the US in 1964. I dig the early Stones material, although a lot of it isn't some of my favorite work of theirs, but this album has some really strong bluesy covers here, kind of similar to what the Beatles were doing earlier in their careers, reliant on covers, pumping out multiple releases for the UK and US audiences respectively, so it's definitely some solid British invasion rock here by the Rolling Stones. Still young, still in their infancy, but, still turning out some really solid music here. So with that in mind, I wanted to put it in the top 20, so coming in at number 19, going to go with 12 by 5, released in the US in 1964. Fast forward 1 year later here to December's Children and Everybody. released in the US in 1965. The timeline of early Stones material between the US and UK releases is kind of messy when it comes to different track listings, release dates, stuff like that, but this album is more of a compilation of tracks featuring stuff from the Out of Our Heads album, their debut EP, and Got Live If You Want It, but it also has Get Off of My Cloud, which is a stone cold classic here by the Rolling Stones, and also you have As the Tears Go By as well, which I really like. So when talking about, early Stones records, basically dealing with very similar material for a lot of those albums. It's not some of the more serious work, but I think it's a great start, right, is this era of the band, so definitely could see what they were capable of as they were starting to, really start to put things together. More of the early Stones stuff here for my number 17. Let's go with the debut, released in 1964. Slightly different track listing on the US edition, where it was subtitled England's Newest Hitmakers. This is more young Stones here. I really like this debut. I think it has this great raw sound and vibe to it of just the young Stones kind of jamming together in the studio and putting out some great blues and R&B tracks, covers like that, but they still had a long way to go for sure, but, they absolutely would come into their own in the following years, and so it's a really fun debut record to go back and listen to and, see where they started and what they would, become in the years to follow, but still, solid stuff here, lots of fun, in my opinion, so wanted to put it at number 17 on the list. Not one of my favorites, but still, I think, fun, early Rolling Stones, good for, what it is. I'd say everything from here on out ranges from really good to great, in my opinion, so for number 16, I'm going to go with Emotional Rescue from 1980. The Stones came roaring into the decade here, the follow-up to Some Girls. The title track is lots of fun, in my opinion, injected with a little bit of that disco sound that was popular at the time as well. So, right, definitely a bit dated in that respect, but nonetheless, fun to listen to. Also features the great She's So Cold and Dance Part 1, Indian Girl, Send It To Me. Not as good as Some Girls, but still a very solid listen in my opinion, and again, everything from here on out I would, rank as, very good to great, so a very strong album here in my opinion is Emotional Rescue, my number 16. The number 15 spot is going to go to Black and Blue from 1976, the first album with Ronnie Wood in the band after the departure of Mick Taylor. This record served as, a bit of an audition for Ronnie Wood, as Keith Richards did most of the guitar work for this record, but Ronnie Wood did contribute a little bit here, so the Stones really weren't sure what direction they were going to go in terms of picking a new replacement here for Taylor, but still, Ronnie Wood does some solid work here, and of course, Keith Richards on the guitar, really, really strong. This album is probably my least favorite of their 70s output, but at the same time, it has some really great highs with tracks like Hot Stuff, the very underrated Memory Motel, love that song, and Fool to Cry. Not a fantastic album, like not in the upper echelon, I would say, but still very good, has some fantastic moments. Next, I'm going to go with Steel Wheels from 1989, a very strong comeback for the Stones after their mid-80s lull, with songs on here like Rock in a Hard Place, Break the Spell, and Mixed Emotions. Very, very solid stuff. I dig it quite a bit, and the tour for this album was fantastic as well. At number 13, we're going to go with their most recent album, that's Hackney Diamonds from 2023. Is it unpopular to have Hackney Diamonds ranked higher than Steel Wheels? I'm not really sure, but still, I wanted to put this album as high up on the list as I possibly could because I think this is their best album in decades. It's a great throwback to the classic Stones sound of the 70s here. We're able to capture that raw, fun, youthful energy of classic Rolling Stones. They released a great album here in their 80s, and that's amazing. Definitely my hard rock album of the year at this point, with tracks in here like Angry, great riff, Get Close, Depending on You, Bite My Head Off featuring Paul McCartney, love that song, really aggressive. Whole Wide World, Dreamy Skies, Mess It Up, Live by the Sword is a lot of fun. Sweet Sounds of Heaven, sounds like one of those classic gospel, bluesy type of Rolling Stones songs that they would release that you'd hear on the radio quite often. So these songs, I think a lot of them would fit on a lot of classic old school Stones records, and that's probably my favorite aspect here of this album. There are a lot of tracks that wouldn't sound out of place on albums like, say, Tattoo You, or Beggar's Banquet, or Let It Bleed, stuff like that. So I really enjoy this album. I'm shocked at the output here by the Stones in their 80s. I mean, this is some fantastic stuff, and again, I wanted to rank it as high as I could on this list. I think 13 is a fair spot for it, but again, as I keep listening and it continues to grow on me, there's a chance it goes even higher on this list, but there is definitely a little bit of bias on my part because I was so excited to, go to the record store and buy a Stones album, a new Stones album, I should say, and a classic one at that when it first came out, so that was a really cool experience, so I didn't think I was ever going to get to do that, so, really, really great stuff here, and Hackney Diamonds is already an album that, I would consider to be, a special record, so with that in mind, 13 seems to be a good place for it, in my opinion. Really, really strong stuff as far as I'm concerned. From the most recent album now, we're going to go all the way back to 1965 for number 12, Out of Our Heads. You know, some great bluesy covers on here. I think it's a great display of the British interpretation of American R&B, and of course you have the classic Satisfaction on this record as well. You know, I love the guitar work on here by Keith Richards, really giving a different vibe to some of those R&B covers. So with that in mind, it's great stuff, a classic for sure, and coming in at number 12 on the list, have to put it, you know, somewhere near the top 10. So with that said, coming in at number 12 here, we have Out of Our Heads from 1965. Number 11, Tattoo You from 1981. Of course, monster record here, right? You know, everyone knows Start Me Up as soon as that opening riff hits. Fantastic stuff, but, you know, Start Me Up is a bit overplayed in my opinion. I enjoy some other tracks on here a little bit more, like Hang Fire, Slave, Waiting on a Friend, and the incredibly fun Neighbors, which is, as if I can remember correctly, I think the first Rolling Stones song I ever heard, which that goes way back, but is a lot of fun. You know, I really love that track. So, you know, when it comes to this album here, you know, do some people tend to rank it maybe a little bit higher than it should be? Sure, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of fun, memorable tracks on here. This was a big success for the band and a great album here to follow up Emotional Rescue. So with that said, wanted to put it near the top 10. I think number 11 is a good spot for it. Top 10 now. For my number 10, let's go with Aftermath, released in 1965. This is where the Stones really started to kick things into the next year with this album. It's their first record of original compositions and does a great job of implementing a wide array of musical genres and elements without sounding all over the place. You know, it's a good balance of rock, blues, soul, and folk. And experimentation as well brought in by Brian Jones. So some standout tracks here include Mother's Little Helper, Under My Thumb, Lady Jane is great, Going Home, and, you know, many more, as well as Painted Black, which is part of the US edition. So really fantastic album here. Had to make the top 10. Gonna go with Aftermath from 1965. Number 9, Between the Buttons, released in 1967. Like a lot of these mid-60s records, you know, the track listings are different between the US and the UK editions here, but I definitely prefer the US version because it includes the great Ruby Tuesday and Let's Spend the Night Together. Two fantastic tracks, two of my favorites from the Stones, definitely my favorites from this album, and this was the time where the Stones really started to put things together. If Aftermath was their first masterpiece, this was their second, and a great follow-up to that album that I just mentioned and just ranked here on the list at number 10. So it's a really great record here that sees everything starting to fall into place for the band, and, you know, it's a fantastic, memorable listen. Number 8, how about It's Only Rock and Roll, released in 1974. This was the final album with Mick Taylor in the group, and it wasn't as successful as some of the previous albums from the Taylor years, but I still enjoy it a lot. And you look at the track listing, of course, there's the classic title track here. It's a radio staple, but beyond that, there's Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Let's see. Till the Next Goodbye, Time Waits for No One has this amazing guitar solo by Mick Taylor. Love that. And, you know, some might not have this album ranked as high as I would, but I think it's another terrific rockin' album here by the Stones. Some great 70s material here that I enjoy quite a bit. So coming in at number 8, gonna go with It's Only Rock and Roll from 1974. Number 7 now, Goat's Head Soup from 1973. Right in the midst of arguably the Stones' greatest period here. The early 70s was a very creative time for the band, and this album is another killer example of that. You know, of course, Angie, the lead single off of this record, is a monster hit for them, but, you know, also in addition to that, you have tracks like Dancing with Mr. D, Silver Train, 100 Years Ago, and Winter. You know, just great songs on this album that, you know, I think have a lot of great re-listenable value to them, so a lot of re-listenable qualities, I should say. So that's definitely enough to secure this album a spot in the top 10. We're in perfect album territory now, so that said, my number 6, I'm going to go with Some Girls from 1978. Good Lord, what a stacked record here. The first to feature Ronnie Wood as a full-time member after contributing on the previous 2 records. It's stacked. You know, Mick Jagger was mainly in charge of the creative here. Keith Richards was going through some legal issues at the time, so Mick Jagger taking the reins creatively for the most part here, featuring tracks like Miss You, When the Whip Comes Down, Some Girls, the title track is just so great. Lies, Faraway Eyes, Before They Make Me Run, and then Beast of Burden and Shattered to close things out. My God, it's a stacked record, and, you know, for a lot of bands, it's be number 1, but just a testament to how strong the Stones catalog is, in my opinion, that it doesn't even make the top 5. You know, it's a very close list from here on out. It's a perfect album as far as I'm concerned, but the Stones also have 5 more albums that I would consider to be perfect as well. Top 5 now, I'm going to go with Let It Bleed, released in 1969. This was the follow-up to Beggar's Banquet, 2 albums that I do own on vinyl, but could not find for this video, unfortunately, but again, when it comes to this top 5 here, any of these albums could make a claim for the best Stones record, in my opinion. So, very close together, and that goes for the top 6 as well, lumping in Some Girls. But, when it comes to Let It Bleed, there was a bit of turmoil going on within the band at this point. Brian Jones was fired during the making of this record, pretty unreliable at this point, and replaced by Mick Taylor. This record features a heavy reliance on gospel, blues, and country rock elements, which I enjoy quite a bit. And it's another one of those absolutely loaded Stones albums here with standouts like Gimme Shelter, Live With Me, the title track, Midnight Rambler is just great. And then, of course, you have You Can't Always Get What You Want, a radio hit. So many awesome songs on this album. It's another one of those perfect Stones records that I'm going to be emphasizing here throughout this entire top 5. Number 4 is going to go to 1971, Sticky Fingers. Again, perfection here by the Stones. Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, Can't You Hear Me Knocking, I Got the Blues, Sister Morphine, great song, love that track. Moonlight Mile is fantastic to close things out. This album is just the band firing on all cylinders here, in my opinion. Like I said before, this was probably the band's most creative period here, arguably their best stuff released during this time period, so I dig Sticky Fingers quite a bit. A fantastic record. I love my copy here, which is like a deluxe edition here. It's got second disc, it's got alternate versions of tracks, extended versions, stuff like that. So that's a lot of fun to listen to. But great era of the band here, in my opinion, and a killer album as well. Coming in at number 4 on the list from 1971. Gotta go with Sticky Fingers. Top 3 now with 1968's Beggar's Banquet. Again, I have it on vinyl. Could not find it for this video, unfortunately, which is gonna bug me. I gotta go find it. But this was the final of the Brian Jones era, although he would contribute to Let It Bleed. He would be fired during those sessions, like I had said. So this is really the final album in which he had, full contributions to. So a great album to go out with, though, in my opinion. Of course, you have Sympathy for the Devil, No Expectations, Parachute Woman, Jigsaw Puzzle, Street Fighting Man, my God. Stray Cat Blues, Salt of the Earth as well. I mean, a lot of classic songs on here. It's one of the most important Stones albums of all time as they, return back to more recognizable and familiar sound after the experimentation on their Satanic Majesties Request. And also in support of this album, they would release Rock and Roll Circus, which, unpopular opinion, is one of my favorite rock live albums of all time. Number 2 is another one of the most important Stones records they ever released. I think a lot of people probably have it number 1, but that said, again, my top 5 really close together here. So coming in at number 2 from 1972, we have Exile on Main Street. Every song on here is a banger, in my opinion. Not a bad song on this record, and some really underrated tracks on here as well. A lot of songs here, right, but a great album. Rock Salt is fantastic. Rip This Joint, Shake Your Hips, Casino Boogie, Tumbling Dice. Let's see here. Loving Cup, Happy is a great Keith Richards track. Let's see, Turd on the Run, Ventilator Blues, I Just Want to See His Face, Let It Loose, All Down the Line, Shine a Light, Soul Survivor. Some really awesome songs on here, in my opinion. Some, more underrated than others, but it's a record here that's perfect from top to bottom as far as I'm concerned, and this was just part of that peak Rolling Stones creativity here from 1972, so had to put it in the top 3. Coming in at number 2 here, I'm going to go with Exile on Main Street. And finally, for my number 1, I'm sure you guys have figured out what's missing on this list. My personal favorite Stones album of all time, maybe a very unpopular opinion, an unpopular pick, but I'm going to go with their Satanic Majesties Request from 1967. I know, not a very popular choice here. You either love this album or you hate it. That seems to be, the way the Rolling Stones fan base feels about this album. There's really not much of an in-between. I love this album to death. Oddly enough, it was the first Stones album I ever heard in its entirety. Of course, I'd heard radio hits and stuff like that, but this was the first Stones album that I sat down and listened to, and I was hooked. Which is a little interesting considering that the rest of their catalog is really not indicative of this album. This is the Stones changing up their sound here, doing the psychedelic thing, experimenting, showing their range as musicians, which I really enjoy. I really love when a band tends to challenge themselves and their audience with something different, and this album is just that. Very different for the Stones. When it comes down to it, there's a lot of great tracks on here, like Sing This All Together, Citadel, In Another Land, 2000 Man, She's a Rainbow is an absolute classic. The Lantern, Gomper, 2000 Light Years from Home. Lots of fun, interesting, different tracks on here that I really enjoy quite a bit, and I would say this is the one album in the Stones catalog that I listen to the most often, even though this list, especially the top 6, was very close together. This is just my personal favorite Stones album, so with that in mind, coming in at number 1 here today, I'm going to go with the different Out There, their Satanic Majesties Request from 1967. So that wraps up this ranking here of the Rolling Stones studio albums from worst to best, which should be visible right over here. Lots of different eras to cover here, a pretty expansive catalog as well, so when it comes down to it, a lot of fantastic Stones records. You have some that are unremarkable, but, more great than bad in their catalog that I, feel like are, great listens, right? So with that in mind here, it was a hard list to make, and my top 6 was especially close together, but That said, I did want to share my thoughts on the Stones catalog, especially with the recent release of Hackney Diamonds. So if you enjoyed this video and this ranking here, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, help me get to 2,000 subs here on YouTube, help me become a 2,000 man, turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload, and please let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my ranking and what are some of your favorite Rolling Stones albums of all time. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.